How well do you know the people sitting at your own table? Not the versions they perform at holidays and Sunday dinners. The versions that exist in the spaces between those meals, when no one is watching, when they think you have already stopped paying attention because you are old and slow and easy to overlook. Have you ever looked at someone you love, really looked, and realized you had been trusting the costume, not the person wearing it? My nephew handed me a glass of something green and sweet, and he smiled the way a boy smiles when he is proud of himself. He was 7 years old, and he had made it himself, he said, from a recipe he found on the back of a juice box. He begged me to taste it. I tasted it. It was too sweet and slightly warm, and I told him it was the best thing I had ever drunk in my life. He laughed and ran off to find his mother. 7 weeks later, I was sitting in a laboratory office looking at a toxicology report, and the room was very quiet, and the technician across the desk from me kept her eyes on her hands. The family, all of them, went completely silent when I read the results aloud. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of people who suddenly understand something they had been careful not to understand before. But before I tell you what was in that glass, and I will tell you everything, you need to understand what kind of man I am, and what kind of family this was. Because the distance between who we appeared to be and what was actually happening is the entire story. And it took a 7-year-old boy and a glass of warm green juice to show me the gap. My name is Raymond Kowalski. I am 63 years old. I live in a house I built with my own hands in 1987 on 3 acres outside of Dubuque, Iowa, and I have lived there alone for the past 4 years. I am a retired civil engineer. I spent 36 years building bridges, actual bridges, over actual water. And after that kind of career, you develop a particular way of looking at the world. You learn to read load and stress. You learn that the most dangerous failures are not the dramatic ones. The dramatic ones are easy to see coming. The dangerous failures are hairline fractures, barely visible, developing over years in places nobody thinks to look, until the morning when the whole structure comes down. I thought I knew my family. I thought I knew their fractures, their weights, their stress points. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that a man of my training should not have been wrong, which is why I am telling you this story. Because if it could happen to me, it can happen to anyone sitting in any living room in this country, watching their grandchildren grow up and trusting the people around those grandchildren without ever once thinking to check. But before I go on, do me one small favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen but never hit the button. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Hit the like button while you listen and drop a comment with your thoughts. You're going to want to stay for this one. My brother Gerald is 5 years younger than me. He has always been the easier son, smoother, more social, better at parties and worse at responsibility. Our mother used to say that I built things and Gerald charmed things, and that the world needed both kinds of people. I believed her. I think she believed it too. Gerald married a woman named Patrice when he was 26, a woman who smiled with extraordinary precision, and who had, even in those early years, a way of making a room feel like it was auditioning for her approval. I liked her well enough. I did not trust her in the particular way I did not trust a bridge that looked too perfect on paper. The numbers were right. The structure was sound. But sometimes there is something in the engineering that you cannot point to and cannot explain. Something that makes you walk across very carefully and hope you are wrong. They had one son, Marcus. Marcus was born in the spring of 2016, and he was a serious, watchful little boy who collected rocks and asked questions that were too complicated for his age, and who, from about the time he could walk, seemed to exist in the state of permanent, gentle anxiety that the adults around him laughed off as sensitivity. He was sensitive. He was also right to be anxious, though none of us understood that for a long time. I visited Gerald and Patrice 4 or 5 times a year. Sunday dinners, holidays, the occasional Saturday when I drove into town for supplies and stopped by because I had baked something and thought the boy might like it. I was not a constant presence in their house. I was the uncle who showed up with cookies and sat in the good chair by the window and talked to Marcus about rocks and bridges and why rivers curve the way they do. I was peripheral. That was, I understand now, one of the reasons nobody thought to include me in what was happening, and one of the reasons I noticed it when others did not. The first time I felt something was wrong, I did not recognize it as a feeling about anything important. Marcus was 5 years old. It was a Sunday in November, cold and gray outside, and Patrice had made soup, and we were all sitting around the table being a normal family. Marcus barely touched his food. He was pale and tired in a way that did not look like a cold. It was a different kind of tired, the kind that sits deeper in a child than a virus can reach. I said something. I said he looked peaky. Patrice said he had been like this on and off for a few weeks, probably growing pains. The doctor had looked at him and found nothing. Gerald nodded and said the same thing. The doctor found nothing. Growing pains. I watched Marcus push his soup around the bowl, and I thought, growing pains do not make a child look like that. But I was the uncle. I was the peripheral person. I ate my soup, and I said nothing more. And I drove home, and I told myself that the people who lived with this boy every day were better positioned than I was to know when something was wrong. I was practicing the specific stupidity of deference. I was deferring to proximity when I should have been trusting observation. 36 years of bridge engineering, and I made the most basic mistake in structural assessment. I assumed that the people who were closest to the structure were the most reliable witnesses to its condition. In fact, the opposite is usually true. The people closest to a failing structure are the ones most likely to have normalized the cracks. Over the following 2 years, I noticed things the way you notice things when you are not looking for them. Sideways, incompletely, filed under categories that kept the anxiety at a distance. Marcus was tired a lot. Marcus had headaches that Patrice described as migraines, which seemed early and unusual for a child his age. But what did I know about pediatric medicine? Marcus, at 6, had what his parents called a nervous stomach, frequent nausea, occasional vomiting that they attributed to anxiety and the particular sensitivities of a sensitive child. The doctors, there were 2 of them, a pediatrician and then a pediatric gastroenterologist, found nothing definitive. Possible functional gastrointestinal disorder. Possible early childhood anxiety disorder. Possible this, possible that. The night I drove home from Marcus's 6th birthday party, a party at which the boy had fallen asleep on the couch before the cake was cut, I sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. I sat there with the engine running and the heat on, and I thought about load and stress and hairline fractures and the particular way things fail when the failure is slow. I thought, something is wrong with that child. I thought, I do not know what it is. I thought, I do not know what to do with what I do not know. I went inside. I made tea. I went to sleep. And I told myself that if it got worse, I would say something more definitive. I would be the uncle who made a fuss. I could live with that. I did not say something more definitive. Not that night, not for another 14 months. In the spring of the year Marcus turned 7, I drove into Dubuque on a Saturday morning for lumber and stopped at Gerald's house on the way back. It was a warm day, the first really warm day of the season, and the yard was green and the windows were open, and Marcus came running out of the house when he heard my truck, because he had been making juice, he said, from a recipe on a juice box. Green juice. He had made it himself. He was proud of himself in the uncomplicated way that 7-year-olds are proud of themselves, with their whole face and their whole body, jumping slightly on the balls of his feet. He took my hand and pulled me into the kitchen and showed me the juice box recipe taped to the refrigerator, and showed me the pitcher of green liquid on the counter. And he said, "Try it, Uncle Ray, try it. Please, I made it for you." There is no way to say no to a 7-year-old who has made something for you. There is no mechanism in a human being for that refusal. I tasted it. It was cucumber and apple, and a small amount of something bitter that I could not immediately identify. Too sweet. He had added extra sugar, which is what children do when they are cooking independently and want everything to be better than it is. Slightly warm, because he had not thought to refrigerate it after mixing. I told him it was the best thing I had ever drunk in my life. He beamed. I poured another small glass and carried it to the back porch to sit with Gerald. And I set the glass on the railing, and over the next 20 minutes of conversation with my brother, I did not drink any more of it. Gerald asked about my work, my house, my non-existent love life. I answered. I watched Marcus through the kitchen window, moving around the way children move, quick and aimless, burning energy. He looked better than he had at his birthday party. He looked, that morning, like a fairly normal 7-year-old boy. On the drive home, I thought about the juice. I thought about the bitter undertone I had not been able to identify. I thought, cucumber can taste bitter when it is old. I thought, children sometimes add unusual things when they are experimenting with cooking. I thought, I am a retired civil engineer, and I have no business speculating about flavors. But the thought stayed with me the way the wrong kind of thought always stays. Not loudly, not urgently, just persistently, sitting in the back of my mind the way a small sound sits in a quiet house at night. You do not know what the sound is. You do not know if it matters, but you cannot stop hearing it. I had poured that second glass of juice into an empty travel mug that was sitting in my truck's cup holder. I did not know precisely why I did that. Some instinct I could not have named at the time. Some reflex of the part of my brain that spent 36 years looking for things that should not be there. I had poured it in and capped it, and then not thought about it consciously for the duration of the drive home. When I got home, I put the travel mug in the refrigerator. I left it there for 3 days. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, I called a man named Dave Purcell, who had worked in environmental testing for the county for most of his career, and who was now semi-retired and consulting, and who owed me a substantial favor from 1998, involving a building permit and a piece of land near the river. I told Dave I had a beverage sample I wanted tested. I told him it was probably nothing. I told him I wanted a full panel, heavy metals, pesticides, common toxicants, anything that looked out of place. Dave said, "You okay, Ray?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said to bring the sample in. I drove it to his office the next morning. He said results in 2 weeks, maybe 3. I drove home and I did not call Gerald. I did not call Patrice. I thought about calling them approximately 800 times over the following 3 weeks, and each time I thought, if there is nothing in this sample, I have caused a significant amount of family disruption for a glass of cucumber juice made by a 7-year-old from a recipe on a juice box. I thought, wait for the results. I thought, I have been in engineering long enough to know that you do not evacuate a bridge until you have confirmed the crack. I went about my life. I fixed a section of fence. I drove to the library twice. I called my brother once to see how Marcus was doing, and Gerald said, "Fine, good." The boy had had another bout of stomach trouble, but the gastroenterologist was adjusting his medication. I said that sounded reasonable. I said to give Marcus my best. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand and looked out the kitchen window at the yard and thought, 3 more weeks. It was 4 weeks and 2 days after I dropped off the sample when Dave Purcell called me. He said, "Ray, I need you to come in." Not, "Here are your results." Not, "I've got some findings to share." "I need you to come in." I drove to his office that afternoon. It was a gray day in early June, overcast, the kind of day that cannot decide what it wants to do. I parked in the lot outside Dave's office building, and I sat in the truck for a moment and thought about load-bearing capacity and the specific arithmetic of what structures can hold before they cannot hold anymore. Then I went inside. Dave's office smelled like coffee and old paper. He was behind his desk with a printed report in front of him, and he looked the way people look when they have information they do not want to have. He had been in environmental testing for 30 years. He had seen things. Whatever was in that report had made him look like this. He slid the report across the desk to me. I read it. I read it twice. I set it down on the desk, and I looked at the window for a while. The gray sky outside. A parking lot. Someone loading boxes into a car. The sample had tested positive for elevated levels of ethylene glycol, antifreeze. Not in trace amounts, not in the kind of marginal quantity that might suggest contamination or accidental exposure. In quantities consistent with deliberate, repeated, ongoing ingestion in small doses. The kind of dosing that, in a child of Marcus's body weight, over an extended period, would produce exactly the symptoms that had been attributed to growing pains and migraines and nervous stomach and a sensitive child's sensitive constitution. Nausea, fatigue, headache, lethargy, intermittent kidney stress. All of it. Every single symptom that 2 pediatric specialists had been chasing for 2 years. I sat in Dave Purcell's office, and I was very still, and the room was very quiet. Dave said, "Ray, are you all right?" I said, "No, I am not all right." He said, "Do you know where this sample came from?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then you know what you need to do." I did know. I had known from the moment I read the word on the page. I had known in the way you know things that you have been afraid to know, that have been sitting just outside the edge of understanding for months, making a quiet sound in a quiet house at night. I took the report. I thanked Dave. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours. I thought about Patrice. I thought about the way she smiled. I thought about the precision of it, the way her face assembled itself into warmth on cue, the way it disassembled when she thought no one was paying attention. I had filed that observation under the category of a person who is better in public than in private, which is a category containing most people. I have not filed it under anything more alarming than that. I thought about Marcus at 6 years old, falling asleep at his own birthday party. I thought about Marcus at 5 years old, pushing his soup around a bowl with the distant tiredness of a child who has been ill for so long that tiredness has become his resting state. I thought about Gerald, my brother, 5 years younger, smoother and easier, better at parties, who nodded when Patrice spoke, who said the doctor found nothing, growing pains, probably sensitive, who had, I realize now, in every conversation about his son's health over the past 2 years, repeated Patrice's explanations, in Patrice's language, slightly delayed, the way a person repeats something they have been told, rather than something they believe. I thought about that. I thought about it for a long time. Then I called a man named Theodore Birch, who had practiced family law in Dubuque for 31 years, and who was the sharpest person I had ever met. And I told him I needed to see him tomorrow morning, and it was urgent, and it was about a child. Theodore said, "I'll be here at 7. I slept badly. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the first time I met Patrice. Gerald's apartment. A Sunday dinner. She had brought wine and complimented my engineering background, with exactly the right amount of curiosity to seem genuine. And I move through that memory now, with the report's findings laid over it like a transparency on a map. And every detail shifted slightly, the way details shift when you change the key. I thought about why. There are reasons a person does something like this. They are not complicated reasons. They are, in fact, the oldest and simplest reasons. Control, money, freedom. A sick child is a child who needs constant care. A child who needs constant care is a child who cannot be argued with, cannot be dismissed, cannot be taken away. A child who has been sick for 2 years and who has 2 specialists and a documented history of mysterious illness is a child whose medical narrative has been written by someone else, and that narrative is very difficult to challenge. I thought about whether Gerald knew. I thought about that longer than I thought about anything else. Gerald who nodded. Gerald who repeated. Gerald who had been, for the entirety of his adult life, a man who took the path of least resistance through every difficult moment, who had never, in all my years of knowing him, been willing to stand in the path of something moving fast toward him. I did not know. I could not know yet. I told myself, Theodore first, authorities second, Gerald third. In the morning I drove to Theodore Birch's office, and I laid the report on his desk, alongside the notes I had written the night before. The timeline of symptoms, the dates of the visits I could remember, the dates I had noted in my phone when Marcus seemed particularly unwell. Theodore read everything. He was a small, deliberate man with reading glasses and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades absorbing bad news professionally. He looked up from the report. He said, "Where is the child now?" I said, "At home, with his mother." He said, "We are calling Child Protective Services this morning, and you are going to the police." I said, "Yes." He said, "The sample, it's still in a chain of custody form from Dave's lab?" I said, "Yes, Dave was careful about that." Theodore nodded once, the nod of a man confirming that the structure he is working with is sound. He said, "Ray, you understand what happens next will be very hard." I said, "I have built bridges over rivers for 36 years. I understand that things that are very hard are sometimes the only thing that will hold." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "All right, let's begin." The next 6 days were the longest of my life, and I am not going to tell them to you quickly, because they do not deserve to be told quickly. They deserve to be told in the order they happened, at the speed they happened, because that is the only way to understand what it felt like to be inside them. On the morning after Theodore's, I went to the Dubuque Police Department, and I spoke with a detective named Sergeant Carol Eames, who was the kind of person who listened without performing listening. She sat still, and her eyes did not move from my face, and she did not write anything down until I finished speaking. And then she wrote a great deal. I showed her Dave Purcell's report. I showed her my timeline. She made copies of everything. She asked me 17 questions, each one precise, each one targeted at a specific gap in what I had told her. When she was done, she said she needed to make some calls. She said, "Do not contact the family yet." She said it the way a structural engineer says, "Do not put any more load on that span." I said, "I understand." I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I thought about Marcus handing me that glass of green juice with his whole face open in pride, jumping on the balls of his feet. I thought about the recipe taped to the refrigerator. I thought about whether he had made juice before, other times, for other people, and what those people had drunk without knowing it. I called Dave Purcell. I asked, If a child of 60 pounds were given small doses of ethylene glycol over a period of, say, 18 to 24 months, small doses, intermittent, what would you expect to see in his kidney function over time? Dave said, progressive damage, likely slow enough to be attributed to other causes. In a child without strong baseline data, and most healthy children don't have baseline kidney panels, you might not catch it until the damage was significant. I said, would you expect it to be fatal? Dave was quiet for a moment. He said, not immediately. That kind of slow dosing isn't usually intended to kill quickly. It's intended to maintain illness. I sat with that. I said, thank you, Dave. He said, Ray, is that child safe right now? I said, Sergeant Eames is making calls. He said, okay, good. I made coffee I did not drink. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window and thought about what Dave had said. Maintain illness, not kill. Maintain. Which meant the goal was not an end, but a condition. A permanent condition of dependency and fragility. A child who was always sick and therefore always needed his mother. A household organized around illness. An insurance structure I had not yet examined, but was beginning to understand in outline. I had the outline of it in my head, the rough sketch, the way you sketch a bridge before the engineering begins. And the sketch was ugly in a way that made my hands feel wrong, heavy, not my own. On the second day, Sergeant Eames called me. She said, we've spoken with Child Protective Services. They have opened an emergency investigation. We are coordinating. The child will be assessed medically. I want you to be available for further questions. I said, I will be here. I asked, is he safe? She said, we are taking appropriate steps. It is the answer of someone who cannot tell you yet. I knew that. I accepts it. I made lunch I did not eat and fixed a section of guttering on the east side of the house that had been loose since March, because I needed something to do with my hands. And the only thing I know to do with my hands when my mind is in a place I cannot fix is to find something physical to repair. On the third day, I called my brother. I had been told not to contact the family. I called my brother anyway, because he was my brother, and because I needed to hear his voice, and because some knowledge is so heavy that the only thing to do with it is to begin, in the smallest possible way, to share the weight. He answered on the second ring. He sounded normal, tired slightly, the way he often sounded on weekday mornings, but normal. I said, Gerald, how are you? He said, fine, good. Marcus has had another stomach day, called in sick from school. Patrice is home with him. My throat closed. I said, how long has he been having stomach days this frequently? Gerald said, oh, I don't know. On and off. You know how he is. Sensitive kid. I said, Gerald. He said, yeah? I said, I need you to listen to me carefully. I need you to go somewhere private to talk. There was a pause. I heard him moving. He said, okay, I'm in the garage. What's going on? I said, I need you to tell me something honestly. When Marcus is sick, who is usually with him? Gerald said, Patrice, mostly. She works from home. I'm at the office. She handles the... He stopped. Something in the quality of my voice had reached him. I could hear it reaching him. The small silence of a person whose brain has registered a change in atmospheric pressure before the conscious mind has caught up. He said, Ray, what happened? I told him. Not everything. I told him enough. I told him about the juice and the sample and the lab results in Sergeant Eames and Theodore Birch. I told him in the flat, even voice I use when I am giving structural assessment findings. No drama, no inflection, just facts in sequence. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted a very long time. Then Gerald made a sound I had not heard since we were children. A specific sound. The sound of a person discovering that the ground they thought they were standing on is not ground at all. He said, "Ray, she's in the house right now. She's upstairs with him right now." I said, "Gerald, I need you to go to work. Right now. I need you to get in your car and drive to your office and call Sergeant Carol Eames. Write down the number." He said, "I can't leave him." I said, "You cannot go upstairs. You understand me? You cannot show anything. You go to work. You call the sergeant. She will handle this." Another long silence. He said, "Did you know before? Did you know and not?" I said, "No. I found out when I found out." He said, "Okay." I said, "Gerald." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Get in the car." He said, "I'm going." He hung up. I stood at my kitchen window and watched a bird work at the feeder I had put up in March, and thought about my brother driving away from his house with his son upstairs with the person who had been poisoning him. And I thought about all the kinds of courage and all the kinds of fear, and how sometimes the most important thing you can do is leave. Because leaving is the thing that allows the people who can help to arrive. Sergeant Eames called me 40 minutes later. She said, "Mr. Kowalski, we have moved up our timeline. We will be at the residence this afternoon." I said, "My brother is on his way to you." She said, "Yes, he called. Thank you." That afternoon, at 2:17 p.m., I know the time because I noted it. Old engineering habit. A child protective services worker and 2 police officers arrived at the house where my brother lived, and my nephew had been systematically poisoned for what the investigation would eventually establish was 22 months. Patrice was taken into custody for questioning. Marcus was transported to a pediatric hospital for a full medical evaluation. I did not know any of this as it was happening. I was sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee in front of me, waiting. The waiting is what I remember most clearly about that day. Not as emptiness, but as weight. The particular weight of a moment when something large has been set in motion, and all you can do is sit with what you know, while the world adjusts itself to the knowing. At 4:45, Gerald called me. He said, "They've got her." I said, "How's Marcus?" His voice was different. Something in it had broken and reformed in a new shape, harder in some places and softer in others than it had been that morning. He said, "He's at the hospital. They're running everything. They said his kidneys show early indicators of chronic stress. They said if this had continued another year." He stopped. I said, "But it didn't." He said, "No, it didn't." He said, "Ray, the juice box recipe, the one taped to the refrigerator." I said, "Yes." He said, "She put it there. She printed it and taped it there. So if anyone ever asked where Marcus learned to make that juice, he had learned it from a recipe. A recipe that was just juice. Nothing wrong with the recipe." I thought about that. I thought about the precision of it, the distance between what was visible and what was true. I said, "Gerald, I'm coming into town." He said, "Yeah, please." I drove into Dubuque that evening, in the long, late light of a June day, and I sat with my brother in the hospital waiting area while they ran tests on his son, and we did not talk very much. There is not much to say in those moments. You sit next to the person, and that is enough. The sitting is the thing. Marcus's full panel came back over the following 3 days. Elevated kidney stress markers consistent with ethylene glycol exposure over an extended period. Neurological evaluation showed no permanent damage. The hospital's toxicologist confirmed Dave Purcell's findings and substantially expanded them. Based on the progression of Marcus's symptoms and the lab work, he estimated chronic low-level exposure beginning approximately 22 months prior to our appointment. 22 months. Marcus had been 5 years old, just turned 5, when it began. The investigation moved quickly after that, the way investigations move when the evidence is clear and the documentation is thorough, and there is a retired civil engineer who has been writing dates in his phone, and the lab technician who maintained chain of custody from the beginning. There were financial records. There was a life insurance policy on Marcus that Patrice had taken out 14 months earlier. The beneficiary, her sister in Milwaukee, which was the detail that made the prosecutor's office sit very straight in their chairs. There was a search of the house that turned up a container of antifreeze in the back of the garage with a measuring cup stored beside it that had residue consistent with the compound found in Marcus's blood work. There was, in the search of Patrice's phone, a text message to her sister dated 17 months prior that read, "The doctor visits are getting expensive, but it's building the record, so that's fine." Building the record. I have been an engineer for 36 years, and I have a precise relationship with language. And I want to be precise about this. Building the record. Not getting Marcus help. Not managing his illness. Building the record. The paper trail of a child who was sick, who had always been sick, who could be established as sick and fragile and dependent, whose mother was devoted and exhausted and in need of support, financial and otherwise. Support that, the financial forensics eventually showed, had already been flowing from Gerald's accounts in ways that a husband who was not looking carefully might not notice. Small amounts, regular intervals, the specific financial signature of someone who has learned to move money in patterns that do not trigger scrutiny. This is what I mean when I say the silence at the family meeting was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people having the architecture of something revealed to them all at once. The full structure, completed, standing in the light. When they had only ever seen individual pieces that they had arranged in their own minds into something that made more ordinary sense. We gathered. Gerald, his parents, his aunt, Patrice's family who came from Milwaukee, and I, at Theodore Birch's office on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after the arrest. Theodore presented the case summary. I sat next to Gerald. Across from us sat Patrice's sister, a woman named Brenda, who had driven 7 hours and who had the face of someone who has been crying for 2 weeks and who carries still a small, hard knot of denial that she cannot let go of yet. When Theodore read aloud the line about the text message, building the record, the room went silent in the way I have described. Not shock exactly. The silence of a thing that has been half known, becoming fully known. The silence of a structure completing itself. Brenda put her face in her hands. Gerald stared at the table. Patrice's mother, who had been sitting very straight and very still, said nothing and did not move, and made a sound that was not quite a word. My father, who was 81 years old and was sitting beside me, reached over without looking at me and put his hand on my arm. He kept it there. His hand was very warm, and I thought about how old he was, and how much he had seen, and how even people who have seen a great deal can be surprised by the particular forms that human cruelty takes when it wears the face of love. I did not say anything in that room. I had said what needed to be said earlier, in offices with the people whose job it was to do something with what I had brought them. In Theodore's office, I sat next to my brother, and I was quiet, and I thought about a 7-year-old boy with his whole face open in pride, jumping on the balls of his feet, saying, "Try it, Uncle Ray, try it. I made it for you." He had made it because he found a recipe, and he was proud of it. He had made it for me because I was his uncle. And he loved me in the way children love, completely, without reservation, without any thought of what the love might cost. He had, without knowing it, handed me the thing that saved him. The criminal case moved through the system with the slow efficiency of a system that has everything it needs. Patrice was charged with child endangerment, felony child abuse, and first-degree criminal poisoning with intent to commit fraud. Her attorney attempted to argue contamination, accidental exposure, environmental sources, a tragic misunderstanding. The measuring cup with the residue ended that argument. The text messages substantially deepened the trouble. The life insurance policy completed it. She pled guilty 14 months after her arrest, on a cold morning in August, in a courtroom where I sat beside my brother in the third row. She did not look at us. She looked at the wall behind the judge's head, somewhere in the middle distance, with the expression of a person who has decided to be somewhere else while their body attends to legal proceedings. The judge sentenced her to 18 years. She will be eligible for parole after 12. Gerald divorced her 6 months after her arrest. I helped him with the paperwork. Theodore handled the legal side. It was the most straightforward thing Gerald had done in 15 years of marriage. And I think that simplicity, the clean, single motion of it, the absence of ambiguity, gave him something he had been missing for a long time. A solid place to stand. Clear ground. Marcus turned 8 during the legal proceedings. He was doing well. His kidney markers stabilized within 3 months of the exposure ending, and the hospital's 6-month follow-up showed continued improvement. He still had some fatigue. The body takes time to repair what has been done to it over 22 months. But he was going to school and collecting rocks and asking questions that were too complicated for his age. And he had, in the way that children have of moving through terrible things when the terrible things are stopped in time, a kind of forward energy, a momentum toward the next thing. He did not fully understand what had happened to him. He was 8. Gerald had told him, in age-appropriate language, that Mommy had done something that made him sick, and that was why she was not living with them anymore, and that was why doctors had been working with him. Marcus had accepted this with the serious, watchful attention he brought to most things. He had asked, "Is she in trouble?" Gerald had said, "Yes." Marcus had nodded and said, "Okay," and gone back to his rocks. I visited them often in the year that followed, more than 4 or 5 times a year, every few weeks. I drove into Dubuque, and I sat in the yard with Marcus while he sorted his rock collection and explained to me the difference between limestone and sandstone. And I told him about river bridges and why they are built the way they are. And he listened the way he had always listened, completely, with his whole attention. One afternoon in the fall, about 8 months after the sentencing, Marcus looked up from a piece of shale he had been examining and said, "Uncle Ray, did you know the juice was wrong?" I looked at him. He had been 7 when I tasted it. He was almost 9 now. Children notice more than you think. They process it on their own timeline, in their own order, and then they ask the question when they have decided the time is right. I said, "I thought something might be off." "Yes." He thought about that. He said, "What made you think so?" I said, "Something tasted unusual, and I have spent a long time learning to pay attention to things that seem unusual." He nodded. He looked back at the shale. He said, "I'm glad you did." I said, "I am too, Marcus. More than I can say." He set the shale down and picked up a piece of quartz. He said, "This one is igneous. That means it came from inside the earth. Pressure and heat changed it into what it is now." I looked at the quartz in his hand, white and clouded and very old. I said, "That's right." He said, "I think I might be a little bit igneous too." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I think you might be, yes." Gerald sold the house on Maple Street. He and Marcus moved to a smaller place on the east side of the city. A brick house with a good yard and a garage that Gerald was slowly filling with the particular harmless clutter of a man who was learning to live simply. Marcus had a bedroom with shelves for his rocks. Gerald cooked dinner most nights. Badly at first, improving steadily, the way most things improve when you give them attention and are not afraid of starting over. I drove into Dubuque on a Saturday morning in late October, the year after all of it, with a pie I had baked and no particular agenda. And I knocked on the door of the brick house, and Gerald opened it in a flannel shirt and old jeans and said, "I thought you might show up today," and went to the kitchen to make coffee while Marcus came running to the door to show me a piece of feldspar he had found at the creek behind the school. We ate pie at the kitchen table, the three of us, in the easy, specific way of people who have no one to perform for. The pie was good. The coffee was good. The October light came through the kitchen window in the long, low angle of the season and lay across the table in rectangles of yellow and gold. At some point, Marcus said, "Uncle Ray, if you come over again next week, I'll show you my new specimens." I said, "I will absolutely come over next week." He went back to his pie. Gerald looked at me across the table. He had the face of a man who has been through something enormous and is on the other side of it, and has not yet decided what the other side looks like, but has accepted that there is an other side. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal. He said, "Thank you, Ray." I said, "Don't thank me." He said, "I'm going to thank you." I said, "Fine. You're welcome." We sat there in the October light and drank our coffee, and the house was quiet and warm, and Marcus asked for another piece of pie, and Gerald cut it for him. And outside the window the leaves were turning on the big maple in the yard, red and orange and a deep particular gold. And everything was exactly what it appeared to be. That is not a small thing. After everything we had been through, the thing that felt most extraordinary was the ordinary fact of a house where nothing was hidden. Where the light through the window was just light. Where a glass of juice was just juice. I drove home that evening in the long dusk, the truck on the highway, the fields on either side going the dark copper of late October. I thought about Marcus's shale and his quartz. I thought about pressure and heat, and what they make of the things they pass through. I thought about a 7-year-old boy, with his whole face open in pride, handing me a glass of something warm and green and bitter. And I thought about the particular fragile thread of that moment. How thin it was. How easily I might have drunk the glass politely, and set it down, and driven home and done nothing. I thought about what I owe that moment. I think I owe it this: the willingness to stay awake, to keep paying attention, to resist the seduction of deference, the comfort of assuming that the people closest to a thing are the best judges of its condition. To trust the engineer's instinct, not the instinct of drama or alarm, but the instinct of careful watching, of noting the small sound in the quiet house, of not filing the unusual thing in the folder marked "Nothing to worry about" until you have actually checked. The most dangerous failures are never the dramatic ones. The dangerous ones are the quiet ones. The hairline cracks in places nobody thinks to look. The bitter note at the bottom of a glass that a child hands you with his whole face open in love. I do not have a tidy final lesson to offer. I am a 63-year-old retired engineer who built bridges and lived simply and got lucky, in the end, that a specific set of circumstances brought me to a specific kitchen on a specific warm Saturday in spring. If Marcus had been sick on that day, If I had arrived an hour later? If I had drunk the glass and set it down and left without thinking to take a sample? The bridges hold or they do not. The cracks are caught or they are not. I caught this one. I'm going to keep checking. If this story stayed with you, join us. Like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear this. And as always, thank you for being here. See you next time. Extended edition follows. Additional scenes from the investigation phase, the night before the confrontation, and expanded epilogue. The week between my conversation with Theodore Birch and the arrival of Child Protective Services at the house on Maple Street was the longest week of my adult life. And I want to tell you about it properly, because it was not just waiting. Waiting is passive. What I was doing was something more structured than waiting. It was a kind of vigil, a deliberate sitting with, the engineering equivalent of monitoring a structure under load and recording every reading at 15-minute intervals because you need the data, and there is nothing else you can do while the data comes in. On the first day, I called my old colleague, Paul Hennessy, who had moved to Ames after retirement, and who was the most methodical person I had ever worked with. And I told him what I knew, and asked him to help me organize the timeline I had been keeping in my phone into something that a detective or a prosecutor could read and follow. Paul was methodical to his bones. He asked precise questions. He worked in silence. 2 hours later, he emailed me a document that laid out every observation I had made over 2 years. Every date, every symptom I had noted, every conversation about Marcus's health that I could approximately date, in a clean, chronological table, cross-referenced with the lab results Dave Purcell had given me. Looking at the table was different from carrying the observations loose in my head. On paper, in sequence, with dates, the pattern was unmistakable. Not suggestive, unmistakable. The rhythm of Marcus's illness was too regular, too consistent, too perfectly timed around periods when Patrice was his primary caregiver, too diminished during the 2 periods I could identify when she had traveled without him. Once to Milwaukee for her sister's wedding, once on a work trip to Chicago, to be anything other than what the lab results said it was. I printed the table and put it in a folder with the lab report. I made dinner I did not taste. I washed the dishes with the radio on and did not hear what was playing. On the second day, I did something I had not done in 30 years. I got out the family photo albums. 3 of them, from the years when Gerald and I were young, and our parents were young, and everything was ordinary and known. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, and I looked at photographs of Gerald at 25, 26, 27. The years before Patrice, the years when he was himself, in whatever uncomplicated way a person is themselves before the choices that define them are fully made. He was a cheerful young man in those photographs, easy with the camera, easy in his body, the particular ease of a person who has not yet encountered something that reorganizes him. There was a photograph of Gerald and me at the river, the summer I finished the Hendricks County Bridge project. I was 34. He was 29. We were standing on the bank with the sun behind us and the completed bridge over our shoulders. Gerald was laughing at something I had said. I was looking at the bridge. I put the albums away. I thought about Patrice meeting Gerald at 39. She would have been 36, 3 years into her second job at the insurance firm in Des Moines, recently separated from a man in Cedar Rapids, whose name I had never learned. I thought about what Gerald represented to someone with her particular orientation toward the world. A steady earner, a non-confrontational temperament, a family with resources and no serious complications. A man whose primary characteristic was a willingness to accept whatever explanation was offered for whatever phenomenon was presenting itself. Gerald was not stupid. He was accommodating. There is a significant difference between those two things, and people who confuse them often end up in situations where that confusion is expensive. On the third day, I drove to the public library and sat for 4 hours reading about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now formally called factitious disorder imposed on another, in medical journals I accessed through the library's database. I read case studies. I read treatment profiles. I read about the specific psychology of it, the particular cognitive structure of a person who requires a dependent to be ill in order to organize her own sense of meaning and control. The reading was cold, clinical, necessary. I needed to understand what I was looking at, not just what the lab results said, but what it meant about the person who had done it. What kind of person? What kind of mind? What kind of organizing internal story? The case studies were consistent. The common profile: high functioning in public, controlled and precise, skilled at presenting as devoted and caring, often medically sophisticated or medically adjacent, frequently holding positions of elevated authority or expertise in their family and social context. The designated authority on the sick child's condition, the one everyone defers to in the medical appointments, the one who translates between the child and the doctors, who tracks the symptoms, who decides when the situation is serious enough for an ER visit and when it can wait. Patrice was the point of contact for every one of Marcus's medical appointments. Gerald went sometimes, but Patrice was always there. Patrice was the one who summarized the symptoms for the doctors. Patrice was the one who called the pediatrician's office with updates. Patrice was the one who knew the terminology, who used words like intermittent functional dysrhythmia and gastric motility and chronic low-grade systemic inflammation in conversations at dinner tables, easily, fluently, the way you use terminology when you have prepared it. I sat in the library and read, and the reading settled into me the way structural analysis settles. Not as an emotion, but as a clarification, a sharpening of outline, the blur resolving into the specific. On the fourth day, I took the folder with the timeline and the lab report and drove back to Theodore's office for a second meeting. He had new information. He had spoken with a colleague in family law who specialized in child endangerment cases, and that colleague had provided some context about what to expect from the investigation timeline, the legal process, the potential charges. The insurance policy was the piece that concerned Theodore most, not because it changed the fundamental facts of the case, but because it suggested a trajectory, an escalating plan, something that had been building toward a specific endpoint that had not yet been reached. 22 months of slow poisoning. A policy taken out 14 months in. The dosing had not killed Marcus. It was not, in the opinion of Dave Purcell's toxicologist friend, intended to kill Marcus quickly, but it was intended to damage his health, progressively, in ways that would document his fragility and his dependence, and the insurance policy suggested that, at some point, a point still in the future from Patrice's perspective, the trajectory was designed to reach a conclusion. I sat with that conclusion. I did not let myself say it out loud in Theodore's office. I did not need to say it out loud. We both knew what trajectory, beginning with systematic poisoning and including a life insurance policy, was likely to end with, given sufficient time and insufficient interruption. A 7-year-old boy with a recipe from a juice box had been the interruption. On the 5th day, I could not sit still. I drove the perimeter of my property twice, on foot, in the morning cold. And then I drove into town and back for no reason, and then I came home and went to the workshop and worked on a section of fencing I had been putting off for months. I worked until my hands were sore and my back ached in the specific way that it aches since I turned 60. And then I stood in the workshop doorway in the late afternoon light and looked at the yard and thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow, Sergeant Eames's team would move. Tomorrow, CPS would make their visit. Tomorrow, whatever was going to happen would begin to happen. I thought about Marcus on the other side of town, in the house on Maple Street, with his mother. I went inside and I called Gerald. He answered on the first ring. I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I don't know. I keep looking at her and I can't." He stopped. I said, "Gerald." He said, "I look at her and she's just Patrice. She's just making dinner. She asked me today if I wanted pasta or chicken. She made it sound so. She asked it like it was normal, like everything is normal. And I don't know how to." I said, "One more day. You are doing this for one more day. Just one." He said, "Yeah." He said, "Ray, what if I had, if you hadn't?" I said, "Don't." He said, "I need to say it." I said, "Gerald, you would have found it. Differently, or later, or in a different form, but you would have found it. You are not a man who could have lived next to this indefinitely without seeing something. You were seeing something. You just didn't know what you were seeing." A long silence. He said, "Do you believe that?" I thought about it. I thought about it seriously, the way I think about structural questions. Not to arrive at the comfortable answer, but to arrive at the accurate one. I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Okay." He said, "Uncle Ray, Marcus's stomach has been bad again this week." My chest tightened. I said, "I know." "One more day, Gerald." He said, "Yeah, okay." We hung up. I went to bed at 9:30. I lay in the dark with my hands behind my head and thought about 100-year floods, the engineering term for a flood of a severity expected to occur only once a century. You design for them not because you expect them in your lifetime, but because they happen. And when they happen, the thing that was not designed for them fails, and the failure has consequences. The 100-year flood principle. Prepare for the thing you hope will never come. Because hoping is not engineering. I had not been prepared for this. I had been living as most people live, with the default assumption that the ordinary is the likely, and the extraordinary is the exception, and that the exceptions are for other people's stories. I thought about what I would do differently if I could go back to that first Sunday in November, with Marcus gray-faced and tired at the dinner table. I thought about what I would have done with the feeling I had had, that specific feeling, not what I would have done with the information I eventually gathered, but with the feeling alone, the pre-rational response, the thing in the back of the bridge engineer's mind that says something is wrong with this span before the cracks are measured. The answer I arrived at, lying in the dark, was this. I would have asked more questions. Not more dramatically, not with alarm or accusation, simply with the patience of a man who knows that the person closest to a structure is the least reliable witness to its condition, and that the second-order observer, the uncle, the peripheral person, the one who comes 4 times a year and sees freshly each time, has a particular responsibility to look carefully and speak clearly. I had not spoken clearly. I had deferred. I had been the peripheral person who trusted the central people and told himself that proximity implied knowledge. I would not do that again. I fell asleep eventually, sometime after midnight. I dreamed about nothing I remember. In the morning I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at the list of things I needed to do that week. Fence, guttering, a section of root cellar door that had been sticking since February. Ordinary maintenance, the daily arithmetic of a house and a life. At 2:17 p.m., A child protective services worker and 2 police officers arrived at the house on Maple Street. I know the rest of that afternoon, the way you know things you did not witness, but have been told precisely. From Gerald's account, from the police report, from what Marcus later said in his quiet, observational way. Patrice opened the door. She was calm. She said hello and offered to make coffee. The CPS worker introduced herself and said they were there regarding a welfare check on Marcus, and Patrice said, "Of course," and stepped back to let them in, and her face did not change in the way that guilty faces are supposed to change in stories where the guilty are easily identified. Her face was precise and controlled, the way it had always been, and she said Marcus was upstairs resting. She would get him, and the police officer said, "Please don't do that yet. We'd like to speak with you first." And then something shifted in Patrice's face. Not guilt, not panic. Something more controlled than either of those. The specific expression of a person who has been running a very careful operation and has just registered that the operation has been compromised. A calculation happening behind the eyes. A rapid assessment of assets and liabilities. She sat down on the living room couch and she said, "What is this about?" The CPS worker said, "We have received information indicating that your son may have been exposed to a harmful substance. We are here to ensure his safety and to gather information." Patrice said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She said it very calmly. The CPS worker said she understood and asked if Patrice would be willing to answer some questions. Patrice said she would be happy to answer any questions. She said she was concerned about Marcus's health and had been for 2 years, and she was glad someone was taking it seriously. The police officer asked Patrice if she would accompany them to the station for further questioning. Patrice said she wanted to call her attorney first. Her attorney arrived 40 minutes later. Patrice was taken to the station for questioning. Marcus was brought downstairs by the second police officer, who sat with him in the kitchen and let him show her his rocks. He showed her a piece of feldspar. He showed her a piece of chert. He explained the difference. He was transported to the hospital an hour later. He did not fully understand why, at 8 years old, you probably cannot explain systematic poisoning in terms that make complete sense to a child who has been sick for 2 years and who has been told every week that his body is just more sensitive than other people's bodies. But Marcus was watchful. Marcus noticed things. He looked out the car window on the way to the hospital, and he said to the CPS worker who was accompanying him, "Is my dad coming?" She said, "Yes, he'll meet you there." Marcus nodded. He said, "Okay." He said, "Can I bring my rocks?" She said, "Of course." He had a piece of quartz in his jacket pocket when he arrived at the hospital. The nurses noted it in the intake report. They noted it because it was something he held in his hand throughout the initial evaluation. Not anxiously, but deliberately. The way a person holds something they have chosen to hold. A piece of igneous rock. Pressure and heat. Gerald was at the hospital before the evaluation was complete. He sat in the hallway outside the examination room, and he did not talk to anyone, and he did not move. He sat there the way a man sits who has used up every resource he has on a single sustained act of not acting, and who now has nothing left to do but be where his son is. Marcus came out of the examination room holding his quartz, and he saw his father, and he went to him the way children go to the people who are their people, without ceremony, without hesitation, directly, as if there is a physical law requiring it. Gerald put his arms around his son, and Marcus let himself be held. And the nurses who were watching looked elsewhere to give them a moment. And I am told by Gerald that it was both the worst moment and the best moment he has ever experienced. Because holding your child when you understand what was being done to him and knowing that it is over, that it is finally, irrevocably over, is not a comfortable feeling. It is not a feeling of relief, exactly. It is a feeling of something enormous settling into the right place after an unbearable time in the wrong place. I try to imagine his face, and I cannot. Some faces are too private for imagining. The hospital ran tests for 4 days. On the third day, the lead pediatric toxicologist, a precise young woman named Dr. Ananya Mehta, who had the particular kind of stillness that I associate with people who work with very high-stakes data very carefully, sat with Gerald and told him that the damage to Marcus's kidneys was consistent with 18 to 24 months of low-level ethylene glycol exposure and was currently presenting as early-stage chronic kidney stress. Not failure, not irreversible damage, early-stage stress, with markers she expected to see improve as the exposure had ended and would not resume. She said, "Had this continued for another 12 to 18 months, we would be having a different conversation." Gerald said, "But it didn't continue." She said, "It didn't continue." She said, "Your brother brought us this sample at exactly the right time. A few months earlier, and we might not have been certain. A year later, and the damage would have been in a different category." Gerald told me this on the phone that night. He told it to me flatly, without inflection, the way a person recites facts they are still processing. Then he said, "Ray, I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "Did you trust her? At any point, was there a time when you thought she was just a woman who loved her kid, and the kid happened to be sick?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Yes. For several years I thought that was probably what was happening." He said, "Then how did you—" I said, "Something in the juice tasted wrong. And I have spent long enough looking at things that shouldn't be the way they are that I know not to ignore that feeling, even when I can't explain it." He said, "If you had ignored it—" I said, "I know." He said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you, Ray." I don't have another word for it. Thank you. I said, "Thank me by teaching that boy everything you know." He laughed, a short, fractured sound, but real. He said, "I will. I promise." The legal proceedings took 14 months. I will not walk you through all of them because the legal process is, by design, repetitive and precise, and does not make for compelling storytelling. It makes for justice, which is a different thing. What I will tell you is that the evidence was thorough, the prosecutor's office was competent, and Patrice's attorney, an expensive man from Des Moines, whom I recognize from news coverage of a high-profile corporate fraud case a few years prior, did everything a skilled attorney can do with a case where the physical evidence is unambiguous and the digital evidence is damning. He did it well. It was not enough. The guilty plea came on a Tuesday. 18 years, parole eligible at 12. The judge read the sentence in a flat, measured voice. Patrice's face remained precise and controlled until the bailiff stepped toward her, and then, just for a moment, just long enough that I saw it clearly from the third row, something in it shifted. Not regret, not remorse. Something more like the expression of a person who has made a miscalculation that she cannot reverse, and who is experiencing, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, the absence of the ability to manage the situation. Gerald did not look at her when she was let out. He looked straight ahead, at the middle distance, at the wall behind the judge's head, and his face was quiet and still in a way that was not emptiness, but the specific face of a person who has arrived at the other side of something enormous and is standing there, catching his breath, deciding what to do next. I put my hand on his shoulder. He nodded once. We drove separately from the courthouse. We met at the brick house on the east side of the city. Marcus was at school. Gerald had not told him about the plea date, had not wanted the day to be a thing that Marcus would remember as the day something happened in court. He would tell him later, carefully, in the right words. We had coffee in the kitchen and didn't say much, and that was correct. Not every moment needs words. Some moments need only the presence of another person who understands what the moment contains. Gerald poured a second cup. He said, "I was thinking of taking Marcus to a rock show this weekend. There's one in Waterloo. They have dealers and exhibits. He's been talking about it for months." I said, "He'll love that." Gerald said, "You could come." I said, "I'd like that." We went to the rock show in Waterloo on a Saturday in September. Marcus spent 4 hours examining specimens with the focused intensity of a scholar twice his age, asking dealers questions they seemed genuinely pleased to answer, negotiating the price of a piece of labradorite with an elderly man in a vest who looked delighted to be negotiated with by a 9-year-old. He came home with 6 new specimens and the particular exhausted satisfaction of a person who has done exactly the thing they most love to do, and he fell asleep in the back seat before we were 20 miles from Waterloo, the labradorite in his hand. Gerald drove. I sat in the passenger seat. We talked quietly about nothing in particular: the drive, the farms, the weather, the state of the highway between Waterloo and Dubuque that had needed repaving for at least 3 years. Normal things. The kind of conversation that is mostly made of the comfortable silence between its words. At some point, Gerald said, "Do you remember the summer Dad took us fishing and we got rained out and we ended up at that diner for 5 hours?" I said, "You ate 4 pieces of pie." He said, "I ate 3 pieces of pie." I said, "4. I watched you." He laughed. In the back seat, Marcus slept with his labradorite. The world outside the car was Iowa in the fall. Flat and vast and gold and copper and the particular deep blue of a sky over open country in September. I have lived my whole life in this landscape, and I find it, most days, sufficient. There are people who need mountains or oceans or the density of cities to feel that the world is adequately present. I need this: flat land and big sky and a road going straight to the horizon, and occasionally a river with a bridge over it that someone built to hold. I drove home that evening in the last of the light, and I sat on the porch for a while before going in. The air had the bite of early fall in it, the first suggestion of what is coming, and the trees at the edge of my property were beginning to show the early colors at the tips of their leaves. I thought about Marcus asleep in the car with his labradorite. I thought about Gerald at 29, laughing at the river with a bridge over his shoulder. I thought about a measuring cup in the back of a garage and a text message that read, "Building the record," and what it costs a human being to decide that a child is a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I do not have access to that way of thinking. I have tried, in the years since the sentencing, to understand it on its own terms, to trace its internal logic, to see how a person arrives there. I cannot do it. I am a civil engineer. I believe in structures that hold what they are designed to hold, and in being honest when they cannot hold it, and in the obligation to repair things that are broken before the failure becomes catastrophic. Some things, I have concluded, I am not built to understand. That is all right. Understanding is not the same as preventing. I did not need to understand Patrice to stop what she was doing. I needed to look carefully and act on what I saw. That is the only lesson I know how to offer. Not wisdom, not philosophy. A simple engineering principle. Inspect what you cannot see into the interior of. Be suspicious of things that look too smooth from the outside. Trust the engineer's instinct, the quiet wrongness, the bitter note at the bottom of the glass. Do not file it in the folder marked "Nothing to worry about" until you have actually checked. Check. Marcus is 10 years old now. He is in the 4th grade. His kidneys are healthy. Dr. Mehta's 1-year follow-up confirmed continued improvement across all markers. He has 38 specimens in his rock collection. He is saving his allowance for a piece of chrysocolla he found at a dealer's website that costs $42, which Gerald says he can have as a birthday present if he still wants it in March. He still wants it. I drive into Dubuque most weekends. Not every weekend, but most. I bring something: pie, cookies, bread, the particular small foods that justify a visit when the real reason for the visit is simply to be present. To be the uncle who shows up, who sits in the kitchen and drinks coffee and watches a boy grow up in the ordinary, unguarded way that children grow up when the people around them are paying attention and the house is a place where things are what they appear to be. Last Saturday, Marcus showed me a new piece he had acquired. A fragment of obsidian, black and glassy, volcanic in origin. He held it up to the window light and showed me how it caught the sun. He said, "Obsidian breaks in a specific way. The fractures are curved. Prehistoric people used it for tools because the fractures are so predictable. You know exactly where it will break." I looked at the obsidian in the light. I said, "That's remarkable." He said, "Most rocks fracture unpredictably, but obsidian is different. Its structure means you can plan the break. You can control where the failure happens." He set it down on the shelf beside his labradorite and his quartz and his feldspar and his shale. I thought about the word failure. I thought about controlled failure, the engineering concept, the deliberate design of where a structure will give way if it must give way, so the collapse is manageable, so the damage can be predicted and bounded, so the people near the structure have enough warning to be somewhere else. I thought about a 7-year-old boy who did not know he was providing the evidence that would save him, who thought he was doing something ordinary and good, making juice from a recipe on a box, being proud of himself, handing a glass to his uncle. The fracture was in the right place. The bridge held. I sat in Gerald's kitchen until the light faded, and then I drove home on the familiar road, the fields dark on either side, the stars coming out above Iowa in the way they do out here, without competition, fully themselves, more of them than a person can comfortably account for. The house was quiet when I got home. I hung my keys. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window in the dark and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which is one of the privileges of being 63 years old and alone and done with the day's work. Then I went to bed, and I slept well. Some nights now, I sleep well. That is not a small thing. That is enough.